Good afternoon. How are you all today? I'm Catherine Wilkins, the Deputy Director of the Middle East Program here at Carnegie. I want to welcome you to today's event entitled The Battle Against the So-Called Islamic State. Where do we go from here? This is a topic that is very much front and center in Washington today. As you all are aware, yesterday the White House submitted to Congress its long-awaited authorization for the use of military force, or AUMF. The AUMF will provide legislative authority for the ongoing military campaign against ISIS that was launched 6 months ago, after jihadists crossed the Syrian border into Iraq and rapidly gained control of key Iraqi cities from Mosul in the north to Ramadi and Samarra outside of Baghdad. The AUMF debate, which has just begun in this town, will certainly increase the focus on a number of difficult questions, including the nature, extent, and duration of American engagement in the battle against ISIS and related groups going forward, the role of our partners in the region in leading this battle, and in addressing some of the root causes that created the conditions that enabled ISIS to emerge. And finally, the extent to which the military campaign against ISIS in Iraq can succeed without an equivalent, coherent military and political strategy in neighboring Syria, which for all the reasons that we're all aware has been much too elusive to date. Today's event will touch on all three of these areas and will look from a regional as well as an American perspective on what has been achieved thus far in the international coalition's campaign against ISIS and what the challenges are ahead. In so many ways, the challenges posed by ISIS run along the fault lines of the region. It feeds on sectarianism. It's fueled by poor governance and lack of inclusiveness. It has been used by actors in the region and outside to promote their own agendas, from Bashar Assad and Moscow to our allies in Ankara and the Gulf states. In many ways, all of us share some responsibility for the emergence of ISIS. This event is part of Carnegie Middle East Program's ongoing work examining the deep-seated challenges facing the Arab region, including our project on renegotiating Arab civil-military relations and my colleague Fred Wary's project on the impact of the new sectarianism in the Middle East following the Arab uprisings. We are very privileged today to have an exceptional panel to discuss the complex issues surrounding the campaign to defeat and destroy ISIS. And I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. First, we're very, very pleased to have Ambassador Luc Manfeli, who has served exceptionally well as Iraq's ambassador to Washington since 2003, and has a well-deserved reputation as an articulate and effective representative for his country in Washington. Second, we are also pleased to have with us today our own Vice President for Studies, Marwan Mouasher. Marwan is back from Amman, Jordan, and will share his own insights into the Jordanian view of recent events, particularly how the horrific recent murder of Jordanian pilot Muad al-Kasabe will affect the coalition going forward. Finally, it's a pleasure to welcome to Carnegie an old friend, Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, who served with distinction for over 40 years as a U.S. diplomat, including as U.S. Ambassador to Iraq from 2010 to 2012, and prior to that as U.S. Ambassador to Turkey. Jim is currently a senior scholar at the Washington Institute for Near East Affairs. Please join me now in welcoming Ambassador Fairley, who will lead us off.
Good afternoon, everybody. Catherine, thank you very much. Dr. Marwan, Your Excellency, Jim. I'm very pleased to be here today and more pleased to be with friends, talk about important issues where it's affecting the daily politics of DC as well as the realities and the challenges we in Iraq face. The country is going through a tremendous transformation. It has gone through 2003, but what we have faced over the last 6-7 months has been an existential threat to the integrity of that state. Iraq now is in a much better position than where we were in June of last year. We have a stronger government, a more unified government. Certainly the political class in Iraq have somewhat stood up to the challenge and have realized that they need to work with each other. provide a similar narrative in the fight, align their understanding of what needs to take place, what support we need, and make sure that the fight against ISIS becomes the only and the key fight we do together. We have other challenges, but we need to do that in a more, what we might call, other issues, put it aside for now and focus on the unity of the country, the integrity of the people, and also making sure that the threat of ISIS do not prolong, because that's having a direct impact on what we might call the character of Iraq, with their viciousness and with their approach of annihilating and trying to ethnically cleanse any area they have influence on. In that state, I think the political blocs have somewhat have put their differences aside. And an example of that is the recent budget law. It has been done in record times, bearing in mind with all the financial challenges we face as a result of the reduction in oil prices, in which the budget has 85% dependency on oil. It can give you an understanding of what the scale of that challenge. In a record time, doing that budget, working together, answering very harsh issues and very fundamental issues, and trying to open up to international support in relation to sovereign guarantees or in relation to IMF, World Bank, and other type of outreach. This has been what I might call a cultural change in Iraq. The budget has reflected the unity and the urgency as well. Same, in addition to that, on the military side, we have, on the military side, we have somewhat had a strong relationship with the allied forces, making sure that the key theme we all talk about is that there is no need for combat troops, but there is a need in relation to strengthen our apparatus, intelligence sharing, trainings, making sure that the Iraqi body is leaner, meaner, more capable of repelling any threat from ISIS. And I think after 6-7 months now, we are in a much healthier position, and we are what you might call in a leaner and a sharper position than we were before. Where do we go from here? I think the key objective for us is to reduce and annihilate or have a zero tolerance toward the ISIS and their existence in Iraq, because this is having a direct impact on our suffering of our people. And to do that, we are working on things like National Guard, the reconciliation in relation to de-Baathification, and in relation to other key challenges. Some of these issues has been there for about a decade. It's somewhat a sense of urgency now in Iraq is created. That sense of urgency has also meant that we need to expect others to understand and appreciate the threat we have faced and the danger the country faces if ISIS get their way. That also, the National Guard is one example. There are others as well in the pipeline. And every day passes by, the Prime Minister starts a new initiative where there is economical, political, military restructuring and so on to address that. The Cabinet is fully supportive of the Prime Minister's moves. He has done a tremendous outreach to every international forum, whether it's been to Munich or Davos or others, to explain that situation, and the Cabinet support that as well. One big outstanding question, which I hope today to be able to discuss with you guys, is how do we move forward with the situation in Syria? Without addressing Syria, political stability of the region will always be in question. The suffering in relation to IDPs in Iraq or refugees as a spillover from Syria will have a tremendous effect on all the regions. We need to have a more predictable politics in that region. We can't do it with ISIS being in Syria and in Iraq, and we can't do it without a light at the end of the tunnel in Syrian situation. This will be a harsh issue. Nobody's saying there are easy solutions, but we think in Iraq, Syria has to come back to the focus of the people. Otherwise, the region will suffer. There are I will finish with just three key issues from Iraq. What do we need to move forward? We have an IDP problem, internally displaced people, of 2.1 million, primarily in the Kurdish region. Elsewhere, they all need support. When I talk about the Kurdish region, I'm just talking about, for example, the weather and at this specific time, for example, how much harsh and how much sort of effect that has. I'm also talking about the need for supporting the development and the provision of basic services to these internally displaced people. So we have a humanitarian challenge. We also have a challenge in redevelopment of our military apparatus, which does mean that we need to make sure that the trainings, counterintelligence, ammunition provision, the right type of weapons, the right type of technology to deal with booby traps and other type of bombs and sort of, I don't know, booby traps which ISIS are putting in our houses when we liberate areas. That certainly requires help there. And the third point is those liberated areas for us moving forward, the day after scenario. What if and inshallah when we liberate Mosul and other towns as well, what do we have as a government in place to look after the people and bring some service provisions and look after them in a sense that any state should do? There we need fund. We need there are the reconstruction fund being generated. The government has already put in for over $440 million. More funds from our regional players, neighbors need to be put in. International support is required. We have a lot of work to do. We are on the right path. The government is all are singing from the same hymn. We need to work together. United States is important, and I will finish here.
Thank you. Thank you. Jim?
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you very much, Catherine. It's a pleasure to be here today. Dr. Marsha, Ambassador Faley, without a doubt, in a very crowded agenda of international crises, the ISIS one has captured the attention not only of the people in the region, but certainly of Americans. The United States is faced with a particular dilemma from my standpoint in trying to deal with it, because President Obama sincerely felt that he had finished America's involvement in Iraq, and while he actually tried to keep some troops on, basically that was another mission accomplished. And suddenly ISIS is on the scene, and of course it is the outgrowth of the al-Qaeda in Iraq movement that we thought was on its last legs in 2010, 2011. And as a result, the administration was slow initially in reacting to the fall of Fallujah in January of 2014. Then when Mosul fell and much of the Iraqi army collapsed, the administration also didn't, other than sending some support troops and some defensive forces for the embassy and the Baghdad airport, didn't immediately engage in airstrikes or talked about it. Some of that was to pressure the Iraqi political system to come up with a more effective national government, and particularly leader, and it got one under Prime Minister Abadi Maliki, the former Prime Minister, who gets a fair amount of the blame for the political problems, particularly with the Sunnis, but also with the Kurds, had to leave. And with Abadi, we certainly had a better partner, and also at the same time, for better or for worse, ISIS launched another offensive that aimed at Erbil, where we had a lot of Americans, and as you know, the President began his combat engagement at that time. In the last almost 6 months now, the administration has put together a large coalition, 60-some-odd countries. As in all of these coalitions, it's not a criticism. America does most of the fighting and bombing, but that's the way it's been since the Korean War in 1950. And it's been pretty successful. ISIS has been stopped. It's been pushed back in some areas, Kobane, the Mosul Dam, Beji refinery, and several other places. The problem is that we don't know where we're going to go from here. As Ambassador Faley pointed out, there's a huge problem with Syria. There's still the integration of the various groups in Iraq, including, particularly importantly, the Sunni Arabs. That is still a work in progress. And there are outstanding issues even between the Kurds and the rest of Iraq that rise up from time to time. But again, that's the Iraq that we've dealt with, and that's the Iraq that has had some fair success dealing with this in the past. The main problem is who is going to dig these guys out. The president's mission that he has given himself, and it's the right mission, is to degrade and eventually destroy ISIS. That requires offensive ground action. He seems to have ruled this out himself in the authorization for the use of the military force. He put a somewhat broader limitation on that, saying enduring ground offensive forces or action. And, but still, this is a major concern because people are very worried in the region, and I think rightly so in America, that this will degenerate into a containment campaign. You cannot contain ISIS by the nature of its movement, and my colleagues here can talk about that more than I from firsthand experience. This is a movement of extraordinary and unique dangers to not just Iraq, not only to us, but to the region, to regional stability. So the administration is now looking for support from Congress, and that means the American public, for at least 3 years more of combat action against ISIS. Exactly what it wants Congress to authorize it to do is left vague, and that will be worked out. But America finds itself back in Iraq. It finds itself in a military confrontation with yet another enemy in Iraq. This is an uncomfortable place for the administration to be, but it has no choice. I'll stop there. And I think I jumped my position.
I did. I inadvertently moved to the right instead of the left. But thank you. Thank you, Jim. Now we'll go to Marwan.
Thank you, Catherine. I've been back living in the region for the last 6 months, and I'd like to bring you maybe some perspective from that region. Before the killing of the Jordanian pilot by ISIS, I was actually surprised by the number of people, particularly among the young generation, who had ambivalence about ISIS. They might not have supported ISIS, but they also were clearly against Jordan participating in the war on ISIS, seeing it as not their war, and seeing it as not their war of values also. This is a war that to them needed not happen. ISIS was outside Jordanian borders, and there was no need to confront it either militarily or culturally and from a value point of view. The killing of the pilot, of course, changed some of that. I wouldn't say all of that. It certainly brought unity among Jordanians that we have not seen since the bombings of the 3 hotels in 2005. And I would liken that unity to a similar reaction here in the United States post 9/11, when also all of Americans rallied behind the flag and wanted revenge and wanted a military campaign against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And we are seeing the same happening in Jordan, where Jordan has stepped up its airstrikes against ISIS. I do not expect that this is going to amount to a ground campaign. I don't think so. But the question in my mind is, did Jordanians change their mind about this being a war of values, a war to capture, you know, who speaks on behalf of Islam or not? I think that question is still out there. There is a feeling of a need to revenge, that's for sure, but it is premature to see whether people or most people will see this as a war of values. I certainly do, but I'm not still sure that you know, a majority, whether in Jordan or in the Arab world, still see that as such, and that's something that is problematic and needs to be looked at. The other point I want to make is that I hope this doesn't turn into a macho campaign, okay, where we only look at the military side. We only, as you know, President George Bush said, we'll smoke them out, okay? It cannot be a military campaign alone. Certainly the military part is needed, and certainly there can be no compromise with ISIS. But let us remember that ISIS' predecessor, Zarqawi and his group in Iraq, were also smoked out in 2007 and defeated militarily, only to pop up again in a more brutal fashion, in a more barbaric fashion, through ISIS. And so there must be something other than just addressing the military aspect of the problem that, unfortunately, in my view, nobody is looking at and nobody wants to even discuss in the region. This is, of course, the region's problem. When I talk about the non-military aspect, it cannot be anybody else's problem. It must be the region's problem. And the non-military aspect has to involve political issues, economic issues, and educational issues in my mind. There can be no escape if the region wants stability to be there permanently, that political inclusion in the region is something that has to be looked at. It is, in my view, a fact today that in particular the Sunnis in Syria, the Sunnis in Iraq, I would add the Sunnis in Lebanon, there's an underlying support for ISIS that might not be talked about publicly all the time. But in regions where they feel the central government in Baghdad has been marginalizing the Sunni community in Iraq, where the central government in Damascus has been marginalizing the Sunni elements in Syria, and where Hezbollah is dominant in Lebanon, there is this underlying feeling that if ISIS is presenting a counter force to these authorities, then fine, why not? We will deal with the barbarism later. And it's again something that is problematic and needs to be addressed. Iraq has a new government that is trying to be more inclusionist. You know, I still think it's premature to judge whether that feeling of inclusion is enough to change the supporting environment in which ISIS works in Iraq or not. Syria, of course, is not there yet, and Lebanon certainly is not there. And then we have to talk about economic opportunity. Not everybody who's going to ISIS is doing that for, of course, ideological reasons. These guys are paying as much as $1,000 a month to people who join them, in a region where unemployment among the youth is 30% in most Arab countries, even in a country like Saudi Arabia. $1,000 is a lot of money. And something has to be done about improving productivity, about creating job opportunities, about moving away from the rentier system that most Arab countries, is engaged in, so that you create opportunity for these people. I talk a lot to the young generation, at least in Jordan, and it is clear to me that their number one concern is finding a job after they graduate, and they're feeling that without a wasta, they will not find such a job, and that the system is not being fair to them in sort of applying the rule of law equally to all citizens. And then the third element that needs to be seriously revisited is the educational system in the Arab world. Again, one can no longer ignore that without teaching people values of diversity and respect for other points of view and respect for other religions and respect for other communities within one's own country and culture, that without that, we are only raising generations who think monolithically, who do not particularly appreciate that their fellow countryman is his compatriot first and foremost, instead of what is happening in terms of the Sunni-Shiite divide, the Christian-Muslim divide, the East Jordanian-Palestinian divide, and all kinds of divides that occur in the Arab world. All this is long-term, and all this requires maybe a generation or two to be addressed. But just because it requires a long time is actually more of a reason to start today than to say, we will worry about this later. What we need to do now is smoke them out, and the rest can be addressed later. In my view, without a parallel non-military strategy to accompany the military strikes, one will not be able to defeat this ideology militarily. You will defeat ISIS, and I don't think, I think we will defeat ISIS. It might take 5 years, but we will. But I'm worried about the second ISIS that will come out and the third ISIS that will come out once we defeat this one, unless these things are addressed. The Arab world has had two huge wake-up calls in the last few years. The first was what is now called the Arab Spring. I call it the Arab Awakening, where people said, if governance is not being addressed properly, we're going to take things in our own hands. And taking things in their own hands resulted in much turmoil in the Arab world that we are, of course, all dealing with the exception of Tunisia. But the second huge wake-up call is ISIS. How come such a barbaric force can emerge and seize such territory and defeat much larger states and armies just like that? If that question is not addressed, if that evolution of ISIS is not internalized such that proper policies are put in place to ensure that we look at the underlying causes that cause some people to flock to such barbarism, if we don't do that, then all the efforts and all the airstrikes and all the money that is going to be spent in defeating this version of ISIS will come to naught and will not achieve the result. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you for raising the broader context. It is amazing that over 90 countries, not just the countries in the region, have contributed to the fighters in ISIS. So this is a problem that reaches into Western Europe and everywhere. Before we start open for questions, I want to just perhaps throw one question out to the panel. Building on what Marwan said about marginalization and sectarianism. The question is, so Iran is also opposed to ISIS, and in its own way is part of this, not part of the coalition, but contributing to the fight against ISIS. Nevertheless, sectarianism appears as deep as ever in the region, and is one of the factors that's fueling the support among certain groups for ISIS. So my question to each of you is if you could comment on the Iran factor, and to what extent the emergence of ISIS is or is not changing the perceptions of Iran in the region, and what the implications of that might be. Jim?
Sure, I'll start. From my standpoint, Iran is not part of the solution, it's part of the problem. And of course, with Iran, we have two separate entities. It's a country and a cause. As a country, even if it's a somewhat hegemonic country, it produces people like Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif and other people we know, such as Rafsanjani, who seem like they're willing to cut deals and sort of appear to be potential partners. But the poster boy for Iran in the region is not Rouhani, perhaps 18 months ago, but now it's Qasem Soleimani, the Revolutionary Guards leader, who is behind all of these advances in Syria, in Iraq, and in Yemen, and supporting Hezbollah and its various actions. And totally apart from the fact that, to some degree, this is also an Islamic Millennialist movement, it's very worrisome from simply the standpoint of geopolitics. Take Iraq. Iran had a good deal in Iraq when American troops left in 2011. It had a government predominantly of Shia Arabs and Kurds who had long-term ties with Iran from the time of Saddam, and who certainly weren't going to lead any kind of attack against Iran that Saddam had. And the Sunni Arabs who might have been inclined to that were in a minority and somewhat isolated. It, however, and it had a unified Iraq, which was very important to it. It, however, kept pushing the envelope, in some respects encouraging, certainly almost never reining in Maliki in his worst impulses towards both the Kurds and particularly the Sunni Arabs, and contributed to the production of ISIS on the scene, just as the Assad government, Iran's ally in Syria, both deliberately and by focusing on other things, produced the growth of ISIS as the primary vehicle for Sunni Arabs to rebel against Damascus. And there is no solution to this problem without trying to contain these Iranian efforts and dealing in a very clear way with, as the ambassador just pointed out, with Syria, and the idea that there has to be a future that the Sunni Arabs of not only Syria and Iraq, but of the region, can see as something involving them, or, as Dr. Mwasher pointed out, they will wind up seeing ISIS openly or silently as a potential counterweight to what they feel is the bigger threat, which is Iran and its allies. We can't have that.
The Arab Spring, Arab Awakening, as our colleagues have called it, and other manifestations do display clearly that there is a social contract problem in the region. One manifestation of that is the various polarization taking place, including the sectarian, the ethno-sectarian, the national aspect of it, and others as well. Sorry. So one manifestation is what we see in the sectarian or ethno-sectarian and other isms. The region over the last hour, can even say since its, let's say after the First World War up to now, has gone through various isms, whether it was Arabisms and others as well. It has a problem in accommodating for the other discourses rather than the main discourse. That's, I think, where we need to address. It should allow for the various discourses, whether it's democratic or free market or any other, apart from the state or the ruler. That's where I think needs to take place. As a result of what we see, primarily more so after the Arab Awakening or the change in the region, regional players such as Iran, Turkey, and others have all tried to project their power. Vacuums have been created. United States has not been able to fill that vacuum. Others have been able to fill that vacuum. In Iraq, after the troop withdrawal in 2011, that was clear that the focus from the United States was not on Iraq. Others have been able to fill that vacuum. The Iraqi institutions were not supported enough or were not healthy enough. The state problems, and let's not forget that after 2003, the state collapsed, not just the government collapsed. The whole state collapsed, and it had to be rebuilt. And what we're doing as Iraqis is rebuilding a state. The formation of the government is important, but it's one layer of it, not the whole layer. So I think within that vacuum being created, it's important that the international community are aware how to fill rightly that vacuum, whether it's in support with the democratic forms in the government of Iraq or other type of challenges such as the Syrian problem. Iran will always want to project its power. I don't think anybody should doubt that. I don't think that's wrong. However, what need to take place is what other projection of power you're doing to supplement that Iranian influence, whether it's in Iran, Yemen, Lebanon, any other country, you can name it. Syria is one example where it has to be a dialogue, and the regional dialogue has to be created. Some of these issues, the United States can help us in providing what I might call an environment for the dialogue. True, getting rid of ISIS is a prerequisite for a dialogue. It may not get rid of it in an ideological sense, as Dr. Marwan talked about, he's right, but militarily, physically, it should be giving a breathing space for that region. And I might even say, don't give Iran an excuse for its projection of power, and work with regional players, work with the people of the region, so that it can provide a healthier environment and it can rely on itself.
Okay, thank you. We have a number of staff with microphones, so I'll select and wait for the microphone to come to you. We'll start right here.
Diyar Wejde from Syria. I'm a Syrian activist. Actually, I completely agree with what Mr. Mashar has said. It was great without developing the region, without sophisticated system for education and for youth, empower the youth and the women, will not be able to achieve anything or face the radical ideologies in the region. But speaking about the root causes for the crisis Syria that you mentioned, Mr. Ambassador, actually in Syria we suffered a lot from the militia, sectarian militia, which came from Iraq to kill the Syrian people and to commit a massacre and kill the Sunni by knife in order to go to the paradise. There was a government in that period in Iraq, the government that you spoke highly about it, and you said that the root cause is not Syria at all. But I think Iraqi government is the root causes.
You have to have a question.
Yes. Yeah. I think for just a point of view.
No, a question.
ISIS founded in Iraq. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was the first leader, then Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, and we have Khalifa, now Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. So would you be able to tell us with a true statement about the role of the Iraqi government to separate this sectarian militia in the whole region?
Okay, we're going to take two more questions, and then we can farm them around. Are there any here? Okay, right up here. Allah's come.
Mohammed Al-Husseini from the Arab League. I have a problem really with the term using Islamic State. I mean, you have in the Muslim world more than Islamic State.
Yes.
I mean, why? This is what the ISIS like to be called. Why should we give them that advantage of calling them the same name they like? In the media, in the Muslim and the Arab media, we don't call really Islamic State. We call the state, the organization of the state. Right. We try to avoid that really. So it's what they are doing. That's against the values of Islam. I think the other point.
Do you have a question?
The other point, the other point is Mr. Mashar correctly regarding education. Yeah, we should start really with education from early age. And I wish there is one universal book that really we can teach tolerance and respect. Okay. So people will grow up with that notion about religions. When I was studying at the American University of Beirut, we had a course called GE, General Education, where we read the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, Thomas Aquinas, Dante, and others. But they emphasize the differences, not the values that they share.
Okay.
We should have that one.
Thank you very
much.
Thank you. I appreciate if you all have a question when right here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Donna Wells, the Clandestine Service Central Intelligence Agency. Can you talk about the health of Assad's army? Thank you.
Of Assad's army? I'm not sure who I give that one to. Ambassador Fairley, would you like to comment?
To start with, I think the ambassador is right when he talks about Islamic State. I think your countryman, Prince Turkey, called it Fahish rather than Daesh, and I think he's right. It needs to be called Fahish. The problem we have in the region is not one of. I mean, ISIS has not created a value problem. its discourse, its method, its strategy, its tactics of force has not helped a dialogue to be created. So that, I think we need to have that dialogue, but not the one ISIS is promoting. In relation to Syria, Iraq, I would say, is the last country who wanted to get involved in Syria. We have clearly did not support the increase in militarization of Syrian problem. We thought this has to go through a political discourse, respect the will of the people of Syria, respect free election to take place and others. We want that. We certainly have not encouraged Iraqis or others to go to Syria, legally or illegally in any way. The Syrian problem has its own challenges, it has its own root causes, it has its own regional problems as well. And I will look at Syria as part of the Arab awakening challenge, which I talked about, the social contract, others. So I think it needs to be looked at in a multi-layer approach rather than just a single root cause. I hope it was a single root cause, then we can resolve it. If it was Iraqis, then we should have resolved it, but I think it's more than that. Education and others, tolerance is an important attribute which we have not been able to promote. It requires us to allow the other, it requires us to accept the other, it requires us to be more, what we might call, in a global world, we be more global, or have more global perspective in your view, in your outcourse and view, and so on. That's a missing characteristics in our region. I agree with you.
Marwan will comment a bit on this question.
Let me say this about education, Ambassador. I think there has been an unwritten alliance between religious and secular forces in the Arab world to push and promote an education system that regards truths as absolute, that has no room for diversity, that doesn't think that there can be more than one answer to a problem, and that does not particularly respect other religions. When Muslims learn about Christians, for example, it's usually by Muslims in a very rare manner, and it's usually negatively. And when Christians learn about Muslims in the Arab world, it's the same thing. It's usually by Christians, and usually negatively, accentuating the differences rather than the commonalities. The objective behind such a system, of course, has been to create a docile society that does not question authority, and therefore to accept whatever truths are given to it as gospel, if you want, or Quran, or the result has been exactly the opposite, of course. People have not been taught the necessary skills to make them compete either in their domestic or regional environment, and as a result they became frustrated and ended up in the street. So if the objectives of an educational system in the Arab world before have been to create peaceful societies, that objective has not been realized. Now, how do you convince today governments that in order to create peaceful and prosperous societies, you need to teach your kids to question you? Is not second-hand, it's not an obvious. It's not an obvious second nature thing. It's not obvious, and yet that is exactly what is needed. Booz Allen has a study that shows that if the Saudi Arabian government, for example, changes its whole educational system in the direction that I am talking about, it will take 45 years for results to be seen. So we are not talking easy solutions. We are not talking short-term solutions. But I am talking about necessary solutions. And if it's going to take 50 years, then we better start. That is not being done, I think. That is not being done. And the Arab world will continue to pay a heavy price if it doesn't internalize this issue.
Thank you. Are there any questions? I'm sorry? Yes, we've discussed it. No one here feels as though they're ready to comment on the status of the Syrian army. Okay, so we'll take some questions in the back, right there.
Roman Mamonov, Russian TV.
A little louder.
Russian TV, RTV. We speak a lot about American strategy, and it's obvious that the main thing is airstrikes, ground operations. But what about ideology? What can be done by the United States or Western countries to fight with ISIS ideology? Because ISIS, it's not about just Islam or something, it's about ideology. And the second question, what about Yemen? Because yesterday, Yemen rebels pledged to support ISIS, and they said, we're not just like Al-Qaeda now, we are ISIS in Yemen. So what kind of impact that can be?
Okay, thank you. We'll take two more, just one right here and one in the back. Go ahead.
Thank you. Jonathan Broder from Newsweek magazine. This is for Marwan. Marwan, you mentioned that there's an underlying support for ISIS among Sunnis in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. I'd like to ask...
Not all of them.
Right.
Not all
okay.
of them.
Right.
Yeah.
But what's the situation in Jordan? Is there underlying support for ISIS in Jordan? And you also mentioned that you don't see the possibility of a ground assault, as the king talks about destroying ISIS and stepping up the pace of his airstrikes. Can you talk about why you don't see the possibility of ground troops, Jordan contributing ground troops to any effort against ISIS? Thank you.
Okay, we'll just take the one last in the back.
Ken Meyer, Court, World Docs. With regard to the execution of the Jordanian pilot, do we know how many people he had killed prior to his immolation?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Do we know how many people the Jordanian pilot had killed prior to his execution?
All right, we'll begin now with the, who would like to start with the first question in the back?
I'll take the last and the first. The last I'll just answer with a question. Does it matter? On the first one, the ISIS military ideological, this is a huge issue in America. But it tends to conflate and confuse, and there's no way out of it, but I'll give you my views. First of all, and I'll use the analogy of the long campaign against the Soviet Union and communism, because when you have not a specific state-to-state military threat, but you have an amorphous threat that has ideological, military, economic, political, and other characteristics, you have a real dilemma. Normally, and I think correctly, states such as the United States, which is typically since 1942 been leading the charge of, if you will, the global security order against such challenges, does a triage. The first thing it focuses on is military, not because we're militarily obsessed, but because it's like a triage. The first thing you do is staunch the bleeding. If you are losing Berlin, if you are losing Greece, if you're losing South Korea, if you're losing Mosul, if you're losing Fallujah, if you're losing Jordan, there's not much you can do about the long-term ideological battle. A, because you're running out of allies, they're all being killed or taken over. And B, nobody's going to listen to you, because the first thing to set up any kind of dialogue, any kind of long-term process of bringing your values and your ideas to bear, or forcing a process among other people to be brought to bear, is to provide security for yourself and for them. And so the priority given to the military is appropriate and understandable and inevitable. The question of the ideology, however, is also important, because you're not going to win this thing by defeating ISIS any more than you're going to win this thing by killing Osama bin Laden or bombing Iran or taking other actions of a military nature. All that does is buy you time. It contains these people. It knocks them down as a force to be emulated. The question of how people are going to deal with the ideological claim of this particular hold, and some of it is Shia versus Sunni, some of it is one or another interpretation of Islam, can only be answered by the people in the region. We can't do that from outside. We couldn't even do that with communism in a very effective way, although that was essentially almost a partner ideology to capitalism in the modern European world. And it was very hard for us. It was the peoples of the regions who decided that they didn't want to have that anymore. So we have to basically use the military to stop these threats, contain the underlying problem, and leave the people of the region to try to work this thing out. It may take a while.
Okay, I will answer the Yemen questions and this ideology one. On the Yemen, I think it has proven historically, and it will moving forward, that Yemen is an important country, and its stability, development is crucial, more so to the Gulf countries. So I think in that sense, we have a sense of urgency now in Yemen. A dialogue of a type seriously has to take place to align the various narratives of the various internal Yemeni stakeholders. Militarization of the solution will not help. Whomever is in who has control now need to realize he needs the other. And in that sense, I think the Gulf countries can play a significant role in working with the stakeholders in Yemen. Otherwise, having an ISIS version or others will not be the end of it. It will have a snowball effect. In relation to ideology, United States should not provide the discourse of what the values of Islam are. It's more for us to define that and for us to have that discussion. And I think there's a realization here in the United States, and rightly so, that they will not get involved into this issue, and they will let the regional players, the regional countries, Azhar, others, Najaf, others, talk about what is Islam, what the values, and how could you counter that ISIS ideology aspect of it. However, the United States can help us in making sure that the various Twitter accounts and Facebook accounts and everything else are not utilized to the advantage of ISIS and others. That's, I think, a crucial question might be asked here is relation to whether the freedom of expression and so on, true, but when it gets involved in promoting violence, I think a line has to be drawn there. I think that's the question which Congress and others have to look at, and obviously the administration, which is working with us now, to make sure that ideology is not best utilized using social media. However, we in the region as well have to seriously talk about what ideology, narratives do we want to define in relation to tolerance and other values we talked about today. That's a key question. We have to raise that question. I would say it's a difficult question. It's what I call soul-searching questions. But I think it's with globalization and other destructive elements which ISIS has had hold of or is trying to project, I think it's important that those questions are raised and talked about.
Thank you. Marwan?
On ideology, again, no one in the region wants the United States to basically wage an ideological war. It does not have credibility if it did that. The last time it did that in Iraq, it ended up with disaster. So whereas most Arabs, for example, are against the Assad regime, most Arabs are against ISIS, but they don't want the United States to provide the ideological answers. The problem, of course, is that, you know, Arab governments are not providing these answers also. But still no one in the region is calling for the United States to wage such a war, and I think it would be wrong if it does that anyway. On the situation in Jordan, before the killing of the Jordanian pilot, the latest poll I've seen suggests that 62% of Jordanians see ISIS as a terrorist organization. That means that 38% don't. That doesn't mean that 38% support ISIS, but that means that at least there's some ambivalence towards ISIS. for the reasons that I mentioned before. ISIS in some cases has become a counterforce, rallying point for people who are disgruntled with their own governments or with the West, and they see in ISIS, you know, a force that is speaking up to the Shiites in Baghdad or the Alawites in Damascus or to the United States or to what have you. That situation, I haven't seen polls taken after Mu'adh Qasasbeh, so I mean, judging from, I was in government when the 3 hotels in Amman were bombed, and I remember there was a significant drop in support for Al-Qaeda then, and I'm sure that is the case today. But one cannot rely on these moments in history because we don't know if they're permanent or not. You have to look at other. Why doesn't Jordan support ground troops? Many reasons, but the first reason is one we share with you in the U.S. Public support doesn't want it. The public doesn't want it, does not support it. The overwhelming majority of U.S. public opinion today is against ground troops. And the overwhelming majority of Jordanian public opinion today is against ground troops. This is one reason. There are many other reasons. Financially, we can't afford it. You know, we're a very small country. Who are we to do this? It is also seen as interference in sort of, you know, crossing another Arab land with Arab troops that are fighting is never an easy thing for Arabs. I'm not saying it has never happened before. Of course it has. But it is something that is difficult for the average Arab citizens. And Jordan certainly cannot take on this fight, particularly if it is asked to do it alone. I do not see, frankly, a scenario where Jordanian ground troops are involved. I think that will create a huge backlash among public opinion that the government cannot withstand.
So we've had some discussion about the importance of the Syrian component of this war, and I can see that my colleague Joe Bahout has a question, and I think he'll help us follow this issue further. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Joseph Bahout from Carnegie. It's not
louder.
on Syria, Catherine. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
God,
I would have liked, but I mean, I think it's. In fact, Marwan, I really fully agree with both your approach, the broad picture, and the content of the approach regarding ISIS. And I'm not saying that because you're my boss, but
but it helps, right?
Yeah, of course. But I have a small caveat, and it's about what you have been articulating for a period now, and I think it's an interesting idea, this cultural war. I think there's a downside here, or maybe a danger in going too far into that, and I would like to have your reaction on that. If we go towards this issue of who is talking or speaking on behalf of Islam with ISIS, first of all, there's the danger of going on the ground that ISIS wants us to go, i.e. a theological debate. And I fully agree with you that this is a political, economic, social, intellectual, cultural debate, but not a theological, religious debate. The second downside, and this is probably more important, is that, and you mentioned it, Mr. Ambassador, if we empower or subcontract that to the religious institution in the Arab world, to do that war, that cultural war, Azhar, Najaf, the clerical institution in Saudi Arabia, and etc., the risk is that we will empower more the official Islam and the statist Islam that, in fact, historically, for the last century, has probably contributed much to produce something like ISIS, i.e. a counter-reaction from a downtrodden, let's say, segment in society against an official or stated Islam. So I know it's a tricky issue, but I think that I think that it is worth being discussed, Marwan, this issue of the religious, cultural, intellectual war with ISIS. It has several downsides, although I agree that this is something to be put on the radar. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we also have a question from Jessica right there, Tiffany. Jessica Matthews.
Jessica Matthews from Carnegie. My question is, I think, along very similar lines, which is in between the 40-year educational approach, which I haven't read the Booz Allen study, but I must say I think that's excessively pessimistic. You'd have a, if you really tried, you'd have a big impact in a generation, 20 years. But between that and the immediate staunch the bleeding approach, there must be, and I think Joseph was talking about this, there must be a whole number of Arab and or regional voices that constitute the ground troops, so to speak, of this attempt to discredit Daesh. So who are they? What are the institutions that are not speaking, that need to be speaking? And what role, if any, perhaps none, do outsiders play in trying to encourage those voices?
I think we'll have one more and then we'll take them.
Michael Kurtzig, formerly of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This lady just talked about institutions. One of the most important institutions is the free and open media and free speech. In Egypt, they arrest the journalist. In Saudi Arabia, you get whipped. In Iran, I don't know what happens to you. Turkey has more than 100 journalists in jail. How can you have any society, and Marwan mentioned it, in fact, that no one questions anything? We question all the time. We would question our Torah, we question our Talmud, we certainly would question Quran and Muhammad, we would question everybody. This is the 21st century, after all. So without a free press, and as our beloved Jefferson said, I may not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. That doesn't seem to be the case in any of these countries, and that's part of an education, which is very necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You want to start?
Okay.
Yeah, I normally try to stay out of soft power things, but I'll jump in on this one because I normally take a very similar view, but I realize that you can be too pessimistic. Around the world, the evolution of democratic liberal societies has been a slow process. Everywhere I've served, and it's been everywhere but one tour in Munich and several tours in Germany with the Army too, but every place else I've served as a soldier and as a diplomat have been countries that have been having a hard time getting this right, as we see it right, and one of the most important things we see to undergird tolerance and democracy and individual freedom is a free press, along with rule of law, an independent judiciary. And all of these things kind of come together. It takes a long time for any culture, any state to develop them. There are things we can do from the outside to help and encourage that process. They're not dramatic. First of all, we will be trumped often by our own security, our economic or other interests. And secondly, our impact is not that great often. Countries don't like other countries, particularly big, powerful countries, telling it what to do. But it's one of the things we can do to answer Jessica Matthews' question. You've got the immediate staunching of the bleeding, that is a security threat here, and you've got a long-term struggle inside a community. Inside communism, it lasted arguably from 1917 to 1989. Gee, how are we going to bridge that? One of the things we can do, and the U.S. government does it, the European Union does it, the UN in its own limited way does it, a lot of other NGOs, think tanks, people on the ground do it, is to try to encourage that sense of tolerance, that sense of media freedom, to give awards to people who do speak out, to embrace those who are willing to stand up for alternative views. And this has an impact. I just can't quantify it, and I can't say it's going to work out. It has worked out in places like South Korea after many decades of pretty tough treatment of journalists and freedom of expression generally. And it could well work out in the Middle East. But it's not an exit strategy for American troops next year. That's my point.
Sure. Joe, I agree totally with you. When I talk about the cultural war, I don't mean a religious war where the winner gets to speak on behalf of Islam. Otherwise, it's back to the winner takes one-one-takes-all approach. What I mean is I don't want anybody to speak on behalf of Islam. Or on any other issue. I'm free to say what I believe in, and you are free to say what you believe in, and let people decide. If the Islamist party in Tunisia can accept a constitution in which the right to believe or not to believe is upheld, and then I compare it to ISIS, who speaks on behalf of Islam? Is it Al-Nahda or is it ISIS? It's a war for diversity. It's a war for freedom of speech, in which no one speaks on behalf of anyone. And I agree with you, free speech has to be a central part of this, and it is not being so. Jessica, you raise a very important point. Where are the ground troops to talk about, these values? They're not there, is the short answer. They are not there. And there are many reasons why they are not there in a mobilized fashion. I mean, you have, voices in the wilderness here and there, but there is no organized, mobilized force in the Arab world that is strong enough to speak on behalf of these values. Maybe it is being formed in Tunisia, but not elsewhere. Because Arab governments, on one hand, suppressed any opposition forces and used Islam to, the Islamic opposition to suppress all kind of political activity. And so the liberals got, buried together with the Islamists. And because the liberals, on the other hand, tended to be, and still tend to be, elitist in the Arab world, speaking from behind podiums, lecturing, but not really involved in constituent politics, where they get their hands dirty and they build constituencies and they build programs that people can believe in. And so today, the state is looking for help. The state, any state in the Arab world, is looking for help from voices who would support its cause against people like ISIS. But it doesn't find that help because the state itself suppressed these voices. And so the rebuilding of these liberal, truly liberal voices is a long-term process that is not going to, unfortunately, unfold shortly. And in the meantime, the radical voices of ISIS might be a minority, but they are strong, they are vocal, and they're organized, and they are not met with an equally credible force, because the state in the Arab world is not credible. People don't believe what the state tells them. So if the state says ISIS is bad, people say, well, if the state is against ISIS, let's think twice about it. I'm truly serious. I'm truly serious. There's a big credibility gap between the state and the public in the Arab world. And nobody is able yet to fill that gap credibly. And the liberal forces are going to take an awfully long time to do that, unfortunately.
Marwan has the luxury of not being a diplomat any longer. I don't have that, so I'm not going to get there. But the notes I wrote, even before His Excellency and my friend Dr. Marwan talked about it, is very similar, but I will give it a different flavor, if you don't mind. The key challenge which the Arab Awakening or Arab Spring highlighted was the different level of discourse in a society, in the same society, as to the level of change you want. Some said it's only the presidency. Others said, no, it's the system of government, the composition of the government. Others said, no, the whole state needs to change. If it's within the same society, you have different discourses, different levels of discussion, or not having a discussion, different level of trying to project a power at these levels of change, then you will have turmoil, and this is what we have had. If the percentage of, not what Marwan talked about, but if you have 5 to 10% of a society strongly support or advocate, or even that might call them a diehard, to organization like ISIS, then we have problems. So counter that, you have a society by its nature have been trained, or I don't know what's the word to use, to become the silent majority and not to be vocal, because they may not have the institutions to be vocal, or that culturally it's not right to go against a clergyman in his Friday prayers talking about takfiri, that every Shia is a whatever, or every Sunni is whatever, everybody without a beard should not be a ruler, or whatever. That's a fundamental challenge. The region is going through that. However, I will differ with my friend in a sense of legitimacy. There are what we might call historical institutions who talk about religion, whether it's Najaf, Azhar, certain houses in Saudi Arabia. Let's give them the voice, but at the same time, don't give them the dominance, and let them make sure that they mature the discussion and not dominate the discussion. I think it's important that, simply because our region do believe in the legitimacy of religion. You can't discard that. You cannot say this is right or wrong. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's right or wrong. It's important that they have that influence. We need to give these institutions some voice. However, let me give you a couple of examples which may articulate my point here. Why do you have Hezbollah in Lebanon and Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt or elsewhere, or let's say even in Iraq we have the Dawah party, who have the influence on that society? They are religious parties because they provide an alternative, not in a religious aspect, but I'm talking about in an NGO perspective. They have institutions, they provide services and others. So let the weak state, which he talked about, become a stronger state, work with them to become a stronger state, therefore, so that they can finish. Let me finish with one last point. I may be wrong, but in Arabic, the English word for nation, there are two connotations or two examples. One is watan and the other is ummah. And there are two separate meanings altogether. One is talks about it from the nation state, like United States. One is talk about ummah, which was we American, not the nation. It's the people, but it's a different ideology. It goes beyond the border. That's where the different levels of discussions has to take place as well. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. I'm wondering if we can just follow up a little on this issue, though, of the credibility gap again. And after all, in the case of ISIS, we're really talking about aiming primarily at a Sunni audience. And in that context, Bashar Assad presents a particular problem, since ISIS, at least technically, is opposed to Assad, and the international community and the international coalition is focused right now primarily on Iraq, where we have partners on the ground. What do we do about Syria? Would any of you comment on that? Are you going first? No?
I mean, I don't have, frankly, I don't have any added wisdom on Syria. The elements for a political settlement are not there. The regime feels it is winning the war and stops at nothing in order to, keep its hold at least on part of Syria. The opposition is hopelessly divided. Either it's a moderate opposition that is really doesn't have much hold on any territory, or it's a barbaric opposition with people like ISIS and that don't offer a better future. So, the choice is between somebody who accepts 200,000 people of his own countrymen to die and an opposition which accepts barbaric activities to stay in power. What do you do? Well, I don't know. I mean, even a compromise at this point, even a compromise is not possible, because neither the opposition nor the regime are interested in a compromise. And several attempts have been made at a compromise, whether it is the Geneva framework or the latest Russian initiative, or none of it is working, because unfortunately, both the regime and the opposition feel they can go on with this for an indefinite period of time. So I don't have any added wisdom, I'm afraid.
It just needed to be addressed.
Well, I would not call it wisdom, but I will call it something else. I think Syria, I mean, rather than the question what not to do about Syria, we need to say what lessons have we learned from it, and therefore move from there. There certainly has to be a reduction in violence, because numbers is no longer an issue in Syria. People being killed is no longer an issue in Syria. Number of refugees is no longer an issue in Syria. And this is, I would say, I might even call it affront to humanity. And I do mean that as well. It's not an issue of internal politics within a country which is becoming out of control. No, it's a region becoming out of control as a result of that. The impact of Syria on Jordan and Lebanon, let alone on Iraq and others, on Turkey, is tremendous. It's taking those countries to the fringe, and I'm sure they've gone past the red line as to how much they can cope with it. That's, I think, an important issue need to be realized. What I feel is that people feel, and we in Iraq have that concern. We know Iraq cannot be stable, permanently stable, without addressing the Syrian problem. We know that, and we're not shy about it. What I fear, what I hear here as well, is that people saying, well, let's contain the problem. It can't be contained in what's taking place now. War of attrition cannot be the approach for it, because the suppliers of those, whether it's jihadists from all over coming to Syria, or whether they are them funds or resources or weapons and others, you can't control that, unfortunately, which means that a political decision, the sooner the regional players, and I do mean regional here, Iran, Turkey, Saudi, others as well, Iraq, in addition to the key international players and Security Council members, have to realize that there has to be a sense of urgency. Otherwise, we are only delaying the catastrophe, and we are facing catastrophe every day.
Jim, just I'm struck by the contrast between what we see in Jordan now and then on the northern border of Syria, the Turkish unwillingness to get involved. Would you comment briefly on that?
Yeah, there are both general reasons for that and specific reasons associated with now President Erdogan. Turkey has been very, very reluctant to get involved in regional disputes for a very, very long time. We in America exclaim the extraordinary performance by an entire brigade of Turkish troops in the Korean War in 1950-51. In Turkey, that's considered an example of American imperialism, hoodwinking Turks to go off and die. And the Turkish military, which is seen as a Western institution, is every much as opposed to interventions outside of Turkey as is any Turkish government, the most important exception being Turgut Özal in 1991. So you have a general situation where, although Turkey sees NATO as an organization to defend itself, today there are NATO air defense battalions from the Netherlands, Spain, I think, Germany, and the United States defending its borders against Syria, and Turkey threw down a marker saying it's not interested in doubling the rapid deployment forces for the eastern countries of NATO. This is not typical of Turkey. It's typical of the exaggerated degree of hostility towards their own alliance that we see with Prime Minister now, President Erdogan. That's the second factor. Erdogan is not, it's probably unfair to say he's not sure whether he's a man of the West or a man of the East. Erdogan is a man of the East. He's now in a position where he can make that apply to the entire society, which definitely is somewhere between East and West, and so there's a conflict there, but he's in charge right now. And he's particularly angry, and here I've been sort of harsh on him. He's got a point. He's been particularly angry at the U.S. government because we don't do enough against Assad, who's killed a lot more people than Daesh, or whatever we're going to call it, has killed. And he sees this as a destabilizing factor for his own country. And he's right. If Assad survives, Assad is never going to forgive Erdogan for leading the coalition against him, and is going to find ways, and there are ways, to make Erdogan pay.
Okay, well, on that note, I think we are going to conclude this evening. We covered a lot of territory. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to our opponents.